What's up everybody, I'm Tim from Timber Ridge Gifts, and this video is going to be all about candle dye. So if you've been making candles for any length of time, you've no doubt seen that there's tons of different options, and it can be a little confusing. So to try to help eliminate some of that confusion, I've got 4 of the most popular types of candle dyes. I'm going to give you my breakdown and analysis of each individual candle dye, and at the end of this video we're going to put these in some wax, see what kind of results we can get. So we're going to start with the liquid candle dye. That's probably the one people are most familiar with. And just like all the rest of these, it's got its pros and cons. In the pro list, as far as the manufacturers and suppliers seem to be concerned, this is the most popular. This is the dye that you're going to find in the most widely available color range. Because this is a liquid, you're measuring it in drops. This is the easiest of the dyes to actually measure and ensure you're getting a much more specific amount into your candle wax. It does definitely have a downside though. The first would be the shelf life. The solvents in the liquid dye will eventually eat away the rubber bulb of the dropper that most of them come with. That will take quite a while. We're talking like maybe 3 to 4 years before that actually deteriorates to the point where you can no longer use it. They do sell replacement bulbs, so it's not a huge issue. The biggest downside to this is the mess. Whatever you get this on, it's not going to come off. If you were to get this on your clothing, on your workspace, it's going to be there forever. Countless times I've gone to work with multicolored hands. Even if you're super careful with the dropper, all it takes is one drop, you get that smeared on something, that clothing's ruined, and really unless you're wearing like a full hazmat suit and gloves, you're going to get this on you no matter how careful you try to be. But in my opinion, this is the best candle dye to use just because of the colors available, the ease of use, the ability to measure it much more precisely, and because it's a liquid we don't have to worry about another piece of wax in our melted wax that we have to get to a specific temperature to melt down. And at the end of the day, this is actually the cheapest to use, and really you're going to have to be working at a very large scale before the cost of any of these really start to make a difference. But just to break down the cost analysis, a 1 ounce bottle of candle dye is enough to bring 100 to 125 pounds of wax to a medium shade. So if you were to break that down to its lowest variable, to dye 1 ounce of wax with liquid candle dye is going to cost you 0.003 cents or 1/3 of a penny. So cheapest, easiest to use, biggest color selection, but limited shelf life and extremely messy. Our next dye selection is the paraffin dye blocks. These are probably the second most popular. You can find these in a wide range of colors as well. Most candle suppliers carry these, but just like all the other dyes, they have their pros and cons. The first pro is its ease of use. One 1 ounce dye block is enough to dye 2 pounds of wax to a medium shade, which is really great if you're working with really large quantities of wax. If you were melting down 10 pounds of wax, it's going to be a lot easier just to throw 5 of these in there than it would be to sit there with your dropper and drop out 70 to 80 different drops. Now the downside to that is, while it's easy to use in bigger quantities, if you're using smaller quantities of wax, these become problematic just because it's so hard to measure these for smaller quantities with any type of consistency. If you're melting down 2 pounds of wax every time, you can just throw one of these in there no problem. But if you have an oddball size batch where you're melting down 1 pound 7 ounces, 2 pounds 9 ounces, it becomes a bit more problematic because you're going to have to sit there and shave tiny little slivers off to be able to get to the shade that you need. That may work the first time, but it becomes harder and harder to replicate because you've got to get those measurements exact each time. And the final con is the cost analysis. This is actually the most expensive way to dye your candles. Each 1 ounce dye block will cost 99 cents. That is enough to do 2 pounds of wax. If you were to break that down to its smallest variable, it's going to cost roughly 3 cents an ounce to dye your wax to a medium shade. If you're doing an 8 ounce candle, not that big of a deal. If you're doing 100 pounds of wax, that cost difference may add up, but at the same time, this would be the easiest wax to use if you were melting down 100 pounds of wax. Bit of a trade-off. Next, we have the dye chips, sometimes called diamond dye chips. These are basically the same thing as the dye blocks, just in a smaller form. Pro for these would be because they are in smaller form. They are a bit easier to use for smaller quantities of wax. But again, if we were to really try to fine-tune our color, we're going to have to start shaving these down into smaller portions than they come. And again, doing that with any type of consistency might be problematic. And unfortunately, not a lot of suppliers carry these, so your color selection might be limited. Another downside to the dye chips and the dye block is these are set in paraffin wax. So if you were someone that was making soy candles and you wanted to stay away from paraffin at all completely, just keep that in mind. These may not be something that you want to use. As far as the cost of these go, on average, they're about $2.25 for 20 dye chips. 3 to 4 dye chips for a medium shade. Breaking that down to its lowest variable, it's about 2 cents per ounce of wax. And last but not least, we have powder dye. Most people probably haven't used this or ever even actually seen it. It's a little hard to come by. There's only a few sites that actually sell it. This is really only designed for large quantities of wax, but can still be pretty useful even at a smaller level. There are a lot of issues you're going to encounter with this. that you're not going to have to deal with the other types of dyes. One being, of course, is the availability. Like I said, there's only a few companies that sell it. Color selection is pretty limited, and depending on what type of wax you're using it in, there are a couple extra steps you have to take. Specifically in soy wax, you're not going to get hot enough for this stuff to completely dissolve, so you're going to end up with a lot of clumps in the bottom of your pouring pitcher, which can create consistency problems if you're adding the same amount every time, but not the same amount as melting and mixing with your wax. So in order to add this to our soy wax, a couple of different things we can do. We can add it to our fragrance oil, make sure it's mixed really well, or we can take a small portion of the soy wax, 3 or 4 ounces, get that a little bit hotter than the rest of the batch, mix this in with it, make sure it's dissolved really well, then we can add it to the main bulk of our wax. So not really ideal for 1 or 2 pounds of wax. If you're doing 150, 200 pounds of wax, this may actually be your best option. Despite the extra steps, it's going to be a lot faster than adding dye chips or liquid candle dye, and it's going to be a bit cheaper than using dye blocks. This averages about $5.95 an ounce. It's going to take roughly 1 gram to bring a pound of wax to a medium shade. If we were to break that all the way down, that's roughly 1 penny per ounce. That was just a quick breakdown of each type of dye, but to truly show you the difference, we need to melt down some wax and actually make some candles. So we're going to start off with our liquid candle dye. Again, it's the easiest to measure. You got 2 pounds of wax. We're going to do 1 light shade and 1 dark shade. This particular brand doesn't have it, but a lot of the other brands will actually have a shade guide on the label showing you how many drops to add for that particular shade. But as a general rule, it's 3 to 4 drops for a lighter shade, 7 to 8 drops for a darker shade. So we're going to do lighter shades on the right, darker shades on the left. So for our lighter shade, we're going to add 4 drops to this pound of wax. And for our darker shade, we're going to add 8. And this is the Cinnamon Rust from Bitter Creek Candle Supply. And you can't tell much of a difference now. Once it dries, we should be able to tell quite a bit of difference. Now for our dye blocks, we're using Navy from Bitter Creek Candle Supply. It was 1 block for 2 pounds. So for the darker shade, 1 pound of wax, we're using a half block. And for the lighter shade, we're going to use a 1/4 block. It is a lot easier to melt these down if you chop them up into smaller pieces. They just melt down a lot quicker. And if you really needed to fine tune it, you could actually use a mini cheese grater. That will get it into a lot smaller particles where you can actually measure it if you needed to fine tune your color. We'll give these just a second to melt down, then we'll pour. For all these dyes, I'm using Golden Brands 464, melted to 150 degrees. Now for our diamond dye chips, guide says 3 chips per pound for a darker shade. So we're going to use 3 chips for the darker shade and 1.5 for the lighter shade. A bit easier to measure at these smaller quantities, but again, if we were to have to fine tune it, we would have to break that chip up into smaller pieces. For that, we could use a little mini grater again, but again, it could cause some consistency issues that we may not be able to duplicate later. And for these, we're using Saturn Yellow from Bitter Creek Candle Supply. And last but not least is the powdered candle dye. This is Brilliant Orange from Bitter Creek Candle Supply. And again, this is really meant for larger quantities. Working with a pound of wax becomes a little bit difficult because it's 1 gram per pound for the darker shade. So to go for the lighter shade, we have to figure out 1/2 gram. It becomes very difficult to measure in those smaller quantities. But we've got it done, so let's get these added and see what the color looks like. And because this has issues dissolving at lower temperatures, I have raised my wax temperature up to 175. It's not really where I want to be for pouring soy candles, but just to stay consistent, I'm going to let this cool to 150. All right, so we've cooled to 150, now it's time to pour and finish up our candles. We'll start with the lighter shade and the darker shade. So we're just going to let these cool, turn into candles, and we'll be able to check out our finished color results. So our candle's completely dried. You can see the colors and the shade variation we were able to get using the different types of dyes. They range from noticeable to very subtle to not really noticeable at all. Again, that's with the powdered candle dye. Working with it in such small quantities of wax, it's really difficult to fine tune it and reach a specific shade. Hope this video was helpful in helping you determine which type of candle dye is going to work for you. You will no doubt develop your own favorite, but as you explore the suppliers' websites even more, you'll find that not every color comes in every specific type of dye. If you guys enjoyed this video, feel free to let me know by hitting the like button. Feel free to leave a comment in the comment section of this video. For more candle making tutorials, tips, and tricks, make sure to check out all my playlists. And to really be a part of the action, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you next time.